engaging in protest or when you're engaging in struggle, the trick is, there was an interesting definition of the UDF in the 80s. You divide your enemy, you unite your forces. Because when you unite your forces and you divide the enemy, that's how power gets constructed.
How are you doing, Prof?
All right, and you?
I'm good. It's been a while since we spoke. I actually took a few pointers from what you said, and I went back, and it actually changed a lot of some of my views, especially on I think I sent you a text on the issue of the DA former Premier Helen Zille and some of the good work she's done there. So I think our engagements, I really do appreciate them because there is quite a bit that I do learn that has changed my initial perspective. So how are you feeling ahead of, obviously we're about to finish the year. Are you feeling good?
Things look good at the university. Everything's on track.
Yeah.
We're about 5 weeks away from the end of the second semester.
Yeah.
Perhaps 6 weeks. So I think that given the conditions, it's not a perfect operation, but the fact that we've saved the year and people have done well and they've moved on and we haven't lost the year for many of our students. I am sorry about what's playing out at Sefako and places like Walter Sisulu, etc.
Yeah. But in general terms, you're quite happy with how we've dealt with this?
Under the conditions. Ideally, I would have liked to have I'd like us to be out of this pandemic, like most people. But, given the conditions, I think we've done well.
I think we've dealt very well with, especially like being a leading university. I think we've led from the front, so that's really commendable. Yeah. So sorry.
No, I'm just saying. Let's see how we end the year.
Yeah.
Hopefully that it's a good thing. I also think it's kind of nice that we've managed the transition well.
Yeah.
I think that the transition between myself and Zeblon has worked seamlessly. It's working. There's been handover.
Yeah.
We take this for granted, but many institutions have, when they go from succession to succession, they're always in a crisis. I think in that sense, it's important that you can do these things without crises, if you manage it carefully.
Do you think UCT transitioned well? They were also in transition a few years ago. Do you think they did well?
It was much more raucous, if you like.
Yeah.
There was a lot of tension between the previous administration and Mamoketi's, the new administration.
Yeah.
And it was more tense.
Yeah.
I do think that they went through a process, but there was more tension between the incoming and the outgoing, between the vice chancellor and the council.
Yeah.
We've managed to keep that all in track without much ruckus. And that partly has got to do with the council and how good they've been.
Yeah.
It's partly got to do with
and you think,
how we managed it.
Do you think it's an institution that we can sort of like look for wisdom to, or like you inspired by some of the work they do there? I know we're competitors in terms of trying to attract the best students.
No, UCT is, I think, UCT, I think, is a powerful institution. I think it's our largest research partner.
Yeah.
So most of our researchers have significant amount of research capacity and partnerships with UCT. I think Mamoketi is a great colleague. I have a very good relationship with her, and we partner quite closely on Arua and African Research Universities Alliance and many other programs. So I have a lot of time for both Mamoketi and UCT. I think it's important. I think if something were to happen to UCT, we'll all suffer, including WITS.
Yeah.
I think it's important that UCT succeeds.
Yeah.
And I do worry sometimes about some of the politics that plays out. the Ombuds report and all of that kind of stuff. It kind of worries me. Because I think UCT is an important place.
But it's good. I know there's always like this little debate, who's the best in Africa and whatnot. I know you've said that you think WITS is the best. Some of the rankings don't agree. Some of the rankings do agree. It always confused, but it's good that they're both strong and they, leading society quite well.
Yeah, South Africa benefits.
Yeah.
It's a benefit to South Africa, whichever comes first. It doesn't matter.
True.
It's South Africa benefits, and that's important.
But Prof, I think let's get down to the business of the day without, wasting more time or, I know you have quite a good schedule. The recent Clicks saga, a lot of people have had their views. I'm sure you've also shared your views quite openly about it. And it kind of ties into the previous conversation we had, and it's unfortunate people didn't get to see it. But I really want to ask, and when we see things like that happen, in your view, what's sort of like the most appropriate form of protest or response from society and across divides, whether political divides or whatnot? How do you think society should respond to such acts of gross racism and injustice appropriately?
So look, I mean, I think that there are three parts to the Click Saga. The first is the racist advert. Yeah. There's no doubt about it that advert was racist and you need to deal with that. That's the first part. The second part is, if you like, the conduct of the EFF and the form of the protest. And the third part is the response of EFF leaders to criticism. Those are three separate indications. Let me respond to the first one. On the advert, it was clearly a racist advert. Now everybody says, well, actually, if only we had more black people there, it wouldn't have happened. Actually, that's not true. We did have black people there. There was a majority of black people who signed off on the advert.
Yeah.
So if you say black people would have seen it, how come the black people didn't? Yeah. The majority of the people in the sign-off team at Clicks were black people.
Yeah.
So I think that it's a more bigger problem than we imagine.
Yeah.
I think there's no doubt it was a completely racist advert. It was stupid like hell.
Yeah.
Now, how should it have been responded to? Well, we've got Section 20, we've got Chapter 9 institutions. We've got institutions who are meant to protect the dignity of the South African public from both public officials and from private officials.
Yeah.
It seemed to me, ideally, there were two options. One, and they're not mutually exclusive. The one is the Human Rights Commission could have got involved.
Yeah.
Or government departments could have got involved. And ironically, they could have penalized Clicks, investigated the matter, concluded on it, and penalized them appropriately. Yeah. By the way, when I listened to the interview from the Click CEO, he admitted it was racist. There was no dispute about that.
Yeah.
And so in a sense, this shouldn't have been hard, and it should have been effected quickly.
Yeah.
Why that didn't happen is a good question. The second thing is the protest itself.
Yeah.
Now, if you do a protest, then there are particular rules around the protest. Now, let's be honest. When you have a protest and people are protesting in an appropriate way outside Clicks, I might say, that seems legitimate. But when you crash the place, when you petrol bomb the place, when you assault people, when you take out guns for people or people take out guns, then you're creating an inappropriate circumstance. And it seems to me that this could have been dealt with by the state Chapter 9 institutions.
Yeah.
Now the EFF's response is, well, the problem is they don't do it. Well, if the problem is they don't do it, replace the bloody buggers who are appointed. Why do you appoint bad people and then say they don't do it? Who appointed these people? Parliament has a role on who gets elected in Chapter 9 institution. You were part of the situation. You make bad appointments and then you say, they don't do the job, and then you try. And that's not how democracies work.
With that being said, Prof, you also went on as far as saying that the EFF is in fact a fascist organization, which probably promotes violence and all of, like, I want you to unpack for us just a bit more for someone who's never heard. So I've read a lot of those views, I read some of your pieces around that, but for someone who has never, like, please unpack for us in terms of that view of saying that it's a fascist organization. Why do you think that they are a fascist organization?
So let's go back to what is fascist ideas.
Yes.
And there are many manifestations of this around the world. And perhaps the best thing is fascist ideas are defined in 3 or 4 significant ways.
Yes.
One is they have racialized and nativist identities. So if you look at Hitler's view, by the way, there's all kinds of contradictions. He wasn't in a kind of classic German sense. Yeah. But in his definition, the German represented the Aryan race, the superior race.
Yeah.
White, blonde, tall, kind of the image of what is the Northern European, this thing. So that's the first. Kind of crude, racialized ideas on who belongs. Yeah. And that's the first. The second is a propensity for violence. A propensity for violence in the way they engage, a disrespect for democratic process, a manipulation of democratic rules. In fact, if you look at the history of the Nazi Party, they used the rules of democracy, but never took on the responsibilities.
Yeah.
That's the second. The third is a penchant for political spectacle.
Yeah.
The idea that it's all about the act. It's all about the spectacle of the act. You must always, if you look at the kind of grand speeches of Hitler, etc., it was all about spectacle. It's all about emotion. It's all about playing without, if you like, understanding the complexity of issues.
Yeah.
And finally, it's about a militarist culture, not only in the form of violence, but a commander-in-chief, the authority, the militarist identity, the authority of everybody.
Yeah.
All of that are hallmarks. Now, if you look at effectively the EFF, and you look at these definitions they needed, I've said this in different articles, I've given crude identities. The identities are crude, they racialized, they effectively nativist in many ways.
Yeah.
Then you've got the violent and the propensity for violent action, the penchant for political spectacle, the militarist commandist culture. All of those are elements. Look at their behavior and look at the behavior of proto-fascist parties now, contemporary ones in Europe. Look at the kinds of ideas that they put forward and the kinds of ideas that Modi in India puts forward, or Bolsonaro in Brazil. And people say to me they can't be because they have left-wing ideas. That's not true. Bolsonaro has got social support grants for poor people. They use that as a mechanism. Hitler was about creating the people's car. That's how Volkswagen emerged. Hitler was about commanding the heights of the economy and repurposing it for militarist agendas. That all falls in part of the kind of fascist playbook. So in a lot of ways, I see their behavior as really problematic. And I know there's a whole series of intellectuals and political activists that don't feel comfortable because they've got a black or brown pigmentation you can't be. That's nonsensical. What do you think?
I think
Idi Amin was. What do you think these guys were?
Yeah, and I think I can gauge where you're coming from with that, Prof. But my thing is, let me play devil's advocate for a bit and ask to say, in the midst of all of that, there is a social overall good that has come out from some of their of these elements that they have to the organization. I mean, you look at now with the whole Click Saga, you and I might not agree necessarily on the form of protest they've embarked on, but the Clicks have now said that they're going to procure obviously now products from small Black businesses, which is progressive for, one of our guests just joined us now, Kana. I'll fill him in later. So there are some good things that have impacted society positively that have come about as a part of their programs and part of programs of action. What's your view on that in terms of balancing what they say and what you disagree with, and some of the good things that have impacted society positively as that have come about directly from the work of the EFF, in as much as you might not think that, they are as genuine or as leftist as they might seem to be, but practically there are outcomes that are desirable for society that have come about as a result of the EFF.
So the question is, let's start with both parts. There's two parts to that argument. So let's put it more boldly. The EFF protested, they were violent. Whatever happened at the pharmacy, what has happened subsequently to that is the fact that effectively cliques have agreed to provide bursaries to people. They agreed to provide sanitary pads. They agreed to procure goods from local businesses.
Yes.
What makes you think that the Human Rights Commission could not have imposed that? It's within its legislative framework. What makes you think that our existing laws, which are very clear against racism, could not have done that?
Yeah.
That's the first point. And to say that somebody has done good, but they might have been bad, but they did outcome, well, that applies for anybody. Hitler set up Volkswagen. It was a people's car. Before that, cars were for rich people.
Yeah.
He did it for the people's car. The apartheid state established schools. Does that mean that we should say they were not too bad?
Yeah.
You know, that's what we were so offended when Helen Ziller said, well, colonialism wasn't all bad. Of course it's bad. You don't say it's not bad because there was roads built or sanitation services built. You could have still built all of those without doing that. So that's the first thing.
Yeah.
Here's the second, which frightens me even more, is the culture that you consolidate in the society.
Yeah.
So what has happened is a party, think about it, a party that doesn't have formal authority to manage an issue, basically under the threat of violence, have effectively forced a private company like Clicks to deliver. Now think about it. Tomorrow, let's say the UDM does not like, let's say Wimpy.
Yeah.
And Wimpy's leader, they don't like the economic policy.
Yeah.
And the UDM goes there, threatens the place, burns the place down, a couple of the Wimpys, and then demands that they do ABC. Then after that, a private agency decides, you and I, we sitting together, we're having a beer, we don't like somebody, we go, we clap them around, and basically you effectively threaten them. Now, you carry on doing that, eventually people start hiring heavies. So what you have is a Clicks or Wimpy starts appointing heavies whose jobs are to keep you safe. What you've done is you've undermined society. You've undermined its institutions. You've created a society where force determines outcomes.
Yeah.
And when force determines outcomes, the people who lose out at the end are the most vulnerable. It's women, it's children, it's the poorest. Because rich people can hire security.
Yeah.
You go and look at what's that place next to Midrand?
Yeah.
Where this big guy, where do the rich live? They lived in closed estates, which are protected by vast security. Where do the poor live? They live in townships where they get mugged all the time. That's why when people talk about who dies in our society from violence, it's poor people. Because they don't have the luxury. That's the point about this. Is the real problem about society is when you allow violence, when you allow extra institutional action. And by the way, there still would be nothing wrong if they protested without the violence. They did do the violence. That's the point. And they knew they were doing the violence because that's how they've operated before. It's not new.
Yeah.
It always happened.
Yeah.
Give me one place they protested without violence.
I hear you completely, and I want to bring Ukanakana. He's also a fellow WITS student. I want to bring him into the conversation just to give his view on what we're discussing now about the EFF's form of protest and if it's a fascist organization. Yeah, Kanakana, you're on platform.
Well, good morning, Bonga, and good morning to the VC of the prominent institution in the continent. It's a pleasure to have you, Prof Adam.
How are you doing?
Well, I'm very much apologetic to the fact that I arrived a bit late to this conversation, but however, I'm glad I'm now a part of it. Well, Professor, I think fundamentally I really agree with you in the sense that we've got institutions in place, right, that have a constitutional task or a constitutional role of combating or fighting racism and all the societal ills that are prevailing systematically or through institutions such as cliques. But however, what I want us to argue on here is the effectiveness or the proper mechanisms, if they are really effective, you know, because you look at the state that we exist in at this very moment. How many people, including our ANC government, by the way, how many people listen to people who protest peacefully? What are the guaranteed returns of a peaceful protest? So many protests happen in South Africa, be it from public service delivery, be it for the scourge of gender-based violence, be it in opening up spaces and institutions of higher learning, ensuring that young people have access to business opportunities. So many protests happen, and we can argue if they are peaceful or violent. But my question is, Professor, how effective or how guaranteed are the outcomes if a protest is peaceful? Me and you can agree here that chances of us having a success return, if the protest is a peaceful one, are close to zilch or zero. Yet we've now imagined a society that only believes that through violence, through force, we shall be able to attain what we want. We can all agree, because at some point, you're a student activist yourself. The best way we achieved this democratic dispensation we all exist in today was through fire. It was through force. And that the late negotiations came through. I fully agree. Prof?
Yep. I can hear you. Sorry.
Oh, okay. No, I was still raising my point. So also on the issue of the EFF, I'm very critical of the actions and how they normally conduct their business. But on this one, I really think on this one, Prof, I must correct you in the sense that their protest was very peaceful, by the way. Their protest, in my own opinion, was an immediate response to what was an institutional way of perpetuating racism or perpetuating that racial superiority does exist, in the sense that Black women do not have hair that appeals to the normal standards of society. So, Professor, in my own opinion, the EFF's response was not violent, was peaceful, but however, they just happened to be a portion of people who were also aggravated by the issue, and they decided that, you know, it's about time we become violent. But the way in which they conducted their business, from the mere fact that their commander-in-chief was at the forefront of maintaining that, yes, ours is to make sure that Clicks shuts down its doors. Ours is to make sure that we protest against this action in a peaceful manner. Should there be an element of provocation, we must meet it with the contempt it deserves. I do not think, in my own opinion, that was a violent protest. Yes, maybe the response to those who were provocative was violent, but the nature in which the EFF had decided to conduct its business, in my own opinion, is constitutional.
So let me respond to you've responded to three issues. One is you've spoken about more principally general about violence and protest and the efficacy of outcomes. The second is effectively on the Click Saga and whether that was a peaceful action or not. Let me start with the first, actually. Firstly, I think you guys do really need to read up on our history, to be honest. And I want to be honest about this because actually, let me say globally, there's quite a bit of research being done about violence and protests, and under which conditions protests are effective or not. And this has been done globally, partly as a result of the Black Lives Matter protests. So there's a whole series of research being done that's tracking over 30 years protests in the United States, in the UK, in South Africa, in parts of the developing world. The academic research is actually showing, to be honest, that it's largely efficient when it's peaceful, not when it's violent. And that's what it's showing. And you'll need to confront that literature. Now, that's the first thing. That doesn't mean, by the way, there isn't some small action that turns out to be violent. I mean, on balance, protests tend to lead to productive outcomes globally in a far more effective way. I've just written a chapter on this, by the way. Yeah. And it looked at some of the literature around this. The second is in South Africa. I think that that's true. Frankly, let me be honest. It's Kanakana, right? Let me be honest. If we went to war in the 1980s, the Boer would have clapped us. They would have clapped us. They would have won the war. We might not have been a democratic society, but they would have won the war. But in the 1970s and 1980s, the Boer had the capacity to conquer Africa from Cape Town to Cairo within 4 days. That was their military capacity. So under no illusions, Umkhonto was a symbolism. The value of Umkhonto was not that he defeated the apartheid state. It frankly was symbolism. And yes, the People's War in townships manifested itself. All that we had the capacity to do. I was there. I was in Mpopomeni. I was in Dansane. I was in Soweto. I can tell you now that our capacity was to ungovern. We didn't have the capacity to win that war. So to be honest, in the real sense of the word, let's get our history right. The third, actually, and I want to use Fees Must Fall, because Fees Must Fall is a classic case where all of us have engaged. In Fees Must Fall, if you look at 2015, in 2015, that struggle was largely peaceful. There were a couple of small actions, but broadly, 2015, between October for 2015 and November 2015, that action was broadly peaceful. There were sporadic incidents, and even that action got you what people wanted. Yeah. That the initial call was no to the no increase. And you got that just by the march. I can tell you now, before that violence took place in Pretoria, I remember at the Union buildings, they had already decided, because on Wednesday, I had had an engagement with people in the presidency that had already decided that concession was coming. The real point was 2016. 2016, you were violent. There were manifestations, and partly the violence was because of political parties. Yeah. And frankly, what did that do? It forced us to bring in the police. And you saw the framework of WITS. Now, whether you like me or not for that, I had made it very clear. Nobody's going to burn WITS down. I'm not going to let it happen. And actually, if I had to bring the cops in, I brought it. By the way, the person who came in was the deputy commissioner, national commissioner. He was an Umkhonto guy. He led it. I brought an Umkhonto guy to manage that. And I wasn't going to let a public institution burn. Yeah. And that's what you do. If you think you have the capacity to win this by violent means, you'll simply get defeated. The real power of protest is not the violence. It's the ability to bring thousands of people. The success of 2015 was you brought thousands of people across racial backgrounds, across rich and poor, on the streets. The difficulty in 2016 was you lost significant sections of that, which is why you were so easily defeated. And that's the point about it. And if you look at what's happening in Black Lives Matter in St. Louis now, what is happening is the white right wing. I'll show you, I'll send you videos of the white right wing merging with the police and beginning to deal with the protests in the manner they are. And now you're beginning to fracture and you're beginning to this thing. So that's the second thing that I wanted to say. And the third and final thing on the Click Saga. Chief, 34 shops were trashed. 2 were petrol bombed. And frankly, I could have told you this the day before. I could have given you how many shops would go, because I can tell you that when Julius and Ndlozi said attack, was a signal. So between you and me, frankly, why it's going to happen again, I'll tell you why it will happen again. Because there wasn't a consequence. And why will it happen again? Because H&M, it happened before and there was no consequence. That's why it happened then, and that's why it will happen again. And if you think that you have to trash a place to get what you want, I can tell you, you could have got the same outcomes without having to trash the place. And you could have, read the interview today with the CEO of Clicks. They had already made the kinds of concessions. But okay, you do this now. Tomorrow, somebody's going to have muscle. Somebody's going to hire muscle. And one of these days, you're going to have a repeat of Marikana, because we're not thinking that through.
Yeah, and I'm sorry to cut you short. I just want to segue to sort of like, which ties in exactly what you're saying, the issue of the forms of protest, especially under Fees Must Fall. In the conversation of transformation in our universities, and when people are saying roads must fall, and all sorts of those transformative dialogue, I'm going to assume with what you've said that you're not entirely happy with the violence that came about of the removal of statues, as well as some of the Fees Must Fall demonstrations. I want to get Kanakana's view on if your view on the Fees Must Fall movement, the roads must fall, if the forms of protest were sort of like appropriate, and if the outcomes were like desirable in your view.
Thank you so much, Makanya. Before I can delve into your discussion, I just want to respond to Prof on something here. He made mention of the fact that he speaks of a report that he went through, he perused it, and he says that largely on a global scale, the protests that yield successful or desired outcomes were peaceful in nature. It is just unfortunate that he didn't point out which protests were peaceful and the desired outcome was received, because I can name a lot of violent protests that happened globally that ended up achieving their own desired outcomes. You know, the Arab Spring in the African continent has done this for a lot of people. Leaders who have been in power for the longest of time were forcefully removed from their own positions. I can go as far as pinpointing the fact that there is an element in Black Lives Matter. I think he made mention of the fact that at first it was very peaceful and it attracted a huge amount of people, and it was a global event because we all wanted to take part in it. We indeed believed that Black lives had to matter. You know, Black lives at some point must start being valued. But Professor, me and you can totally agree that at any point did the US government think of introducing policy reforms to ensure that Black lives indeed matter. The US government did not make any strides in ensuring that in the next 5 years, in the next 6 years, an event such as that which happened when George Floyd was brutally assassinated by a police officer does not occur again. I can assure you that possibly even in the next 6 months, we are going to hear another case of police brutality, simply because, yes, there was a huge element of peace before, but at the same time, the US government refused to listen. I understand the movement may be losing numbers, particularly because it's now becoming a violent action and what so on and what so on. And your second point I want to entertain, Prof, is your concept of saying that had we went to war in the 80s with the Boers, we were actually not going to make it, because the MK, in its own little functioning structure, it was designed to ungovern and not to necessarily go to war. I wish to make reference to an incident that took place in the Wonky Game Reserve, when Chris Hani briefly explains the fact that the then Iron Smith Rhodesian military government posed a huge threat to an MK camp that was in the game reserve, where they were attacked. And it was very fortunate that as much as they did not have enough ammunition, their response was so lethal, they ended up defeating the Iron Smith Rhodesian military at the time. And if you assess the military capacity that it had compared to that of the SADF, or the South African Defence Force, they're now known as the SANDF, you'll actually realize that militarily wise, they were so close with each other because they had the same capacity. And that argument, I wish to rebuke it, because I truly believe that we had enough ammunition, we had enough manpower, we had enough force to drive us to winning the war. So I can definitely put it to you, Professor, that had we went to war at that time, you can be rest assured there was going to be a lot of bloodshed that we can't overlook. But winning the war, I literally believe that we were going to win it. And I don't want to delve much on what happened in 2015, because I was not at this university space when it was happening. You have better knowledge of that than myself. But I am pretty aware of the fact that, I agree with what you're saying. We need to have proper structures put in place of combating systematic errors or systematic flaws without resorting to violence, because the infrastructure belongs to us. The infrastructure is going to play a prominent role in developing our lives, all of us. But at the same time, we need to make sure that this constitutional mechanisms put in place, to ensure that we combat racism peacefully, must be effective as well, so that our people can have
let me respond.
There mustn't be, access. Okay, I'll let you respond. I just want to make this point, then you can respond. Accessing the South African Human Rights Commission on its own, it's a lot of work, Prof. You need to have sufficient capital to go to the place. You need to have legal representation, which in my own opinion, me and you can agree that not a lot of people in this country, the black majority, don't even know about the existence of this institution. So for us to go as far as saying they can be effective ways of fighting these things, it's an argument that is good, but practically it's with the inequalities that exist in this country. Yeah. That argument, Prof, is flawed.
Let me bring you in to respond.
Yeah, so let me just say two things. Firstly, on the Arab Spring, where do you think Egypt is now? I was in the Arab Spring, by the way. I was stuck in Cairo on the first day the protest took place at that in that forum. So I went out, by the way. I was stuck because I was traveling, and I got stuck in Cairo, myself and Iron Rensburg. And we were in a hotel, and Iron said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "You stay here, me, I'm going down." I went down and I walked. I went and sat there. And the thing that struck me about it was the heady atmosphere. Where do you think Egypt is today? Egypt is today exactly under military regime. Let's take Libya, where Gaddafi was. Where is Libya today except a completely divided society in war? It's in civil war, where you can't even have education. People kill each other on the streets. They just shoot each other, whoever has guns. Go to Syria and see where it is. Those weren't successes. Those were failures. You win a battle does not mean you've won the war. Let me give you another example. The greatest success of protests, if this generation of people think about in Western Europe, is about 68, the civil rights movement, and effectively the Vietnam War. What was that followed by? It was followed by Nixon, by Reagan and Thatcher, and the rise of neoliberalism. That's the point. Every protest has been reversed. All the gains of the 60s were reversed by the backlash that came from the right wing. And so when you're engaging in protest or when you're engaging in struggle, the trick is, there was an interesting definition of the UDF in the 80s. You divide your enemy, you unite your forces. Because when you unite your forces and you divide the enemy, that's how power gets constructed. And frankly, every one of those is an example. Today, the consequences of today is because protest leaders didn't think through 67, 68, 69 and allowed for a backlash to play out. I think Chris Hani was one of the great figures of our liberation movement. But I will tell you this, telling me about the war in a single battalion, a battle in a single battalion, doesn't explain the war. Go look at every military analyst in the 80s, including the documentation. Why do you think Madiba cut the deal? You think because he sold out? Madiba cut the deal because Madiba knew, Tambo knew, that a lot of what we were talking about, we had no capacity to defeat them. By the way, today, the SANDF is worse than the apartheid state. Half of them couldn't fight. Everybody talks about Zimbabwe. The Zimbabwean military will clap us. They'll clap us because at least they're active. Ours drink too much beer and they can't even run. Forget this thing. We are in serious trouble as a capacity. But don't believe me, go do the analysis yourself. Don't believe me, but do it. Don't rely on the propaganda. Go and read. There's a whole series of military analysts, independent, global, who will do the analysis for you. Let me finish off one final thing by saying, you spoke about the issue of provocation and the Human Rights Commission. I agree with you. The problem is we can't carry on saying, you see, the tragedy about the Human Rights Commission is it's not supposed to be about how much lawyers you are. It's not supposed to be about how much it costs. The Human Rights Commission's job was as soon as the Click's advert came, they should have moved in. Now, the question we have to ask is why didn't they move? And the answer to that is we've got the wrong guys appointed. Who appointed them? The ANC, the EFF, the UDM. We appoint the guys, then we say, but they don't know how to do their job. If you're appointing people simply because of the pigmentation of their skin or representation without any understanding of capabilities, you can't complain after that. When people say to me at WITS, I'll be honest with you, and I'm sorry to put this. When people say to me, what are you doing? I'll say, you know what? Our graduate output is up 35%. Our research is up 80%. Our finances are up, and our transformation for the first time. Our students are 84% Black. Our administrators are 90% Black. And for the first time in our history, our academics are 51% Black. Now, whether the politicians like me, from our man, the Minister of Higher Education, Blade, to Julius, I don't really care. But I'll tell you one thing, if you appoint people with capability. By the way, we increased transformation. Before I came, let me be blunt, walk into any major dinner table in the northern suburbs of Joburg. They'll tell you WITS is on the way down. Why? Because actually, look, its output is declining. As it becomes more Black, it's going down. Now, ironically, 9 years later, go to any place, they say, whatever you might say, it's going up. It's still transforming, but it's going up. That's the thing. I think, let me end by this. You know, I was in the weekend, Weve was moaning because Weve comes from Vereniging. And he was looking at the photograph of Vereniging. And he says, what happened to Vereniging? It's dirty, the trash is all over the place, and all of that. And I responded, and he said, how can this happen? And I responded, and I said, when you appoint mayors and civil servants that don't know how to do the job, what do you expect? I come from Pietermaritzburg. When I walk into Pietermaritzburg, even as a young black guy, you know, if you went and it was all very racialized in the early 80s or in the 70s, but you went to a library, you didn't have books like you would get in the white libraries, but you had library books.
Yeah.
Right? Now, you don't even have libraries anymore. Forget the books. You don't even have libraries existing. And go to Sobantu, go to Eatonvale, and look at what we've done.
Yeah.
Under black administration, we have buggered our societies because we haven't had the courage to make capable appointments. That's the point. And until we don't learn that, let me say one final thing. You know, Mobutu Sese Seko was corrupt like hell. But you know how he made it? You know how he won? He was the guy who killed Patrice. You know how he won? He won by arguing that Patrice Lumumba was not radical enough, that he was going to advance the black agenda. He even changed his name to Mobutu Sese Seko. Look what he did to the DRC. Learn from those lessons. Because I promise you, when we look at ACE, when we look at the Guptas, we're doing exactly what Mobutu Sese Seko did. I promise you. And that's the real tragedy of our time. You know, I've been writing about the myth of the Rainbow Nation. I'll give you an article I wrote in 1996, 1 year, 2 years after the transition. Said there's no such thing as a Rainbow Nation. Because you can't have a Rainbow Nation without social justice. That inequalities are increasing. I was making these arguments 25 years ago. The point I'm making is don't allow people to use radical language to advance really racialized agendas and fascist agendas. Yeah. I'll stop here. I'm sorry. That's all
That's all you'll say.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And can I just ask one yes or no question from your side before? I know you have a busy schedule. It was a last question, just a yes or no. And can we rely on political parties to drive meaningful change within our society, or do we have to reimagine a society without them?
You see, I think that, I think you need both. This is the point. I mean, how do democracies work?
Yeah.
Democracies work on the assumption that politicians become responsive. Why do politicians become responsive to the people? Simply because there's a threat of you get kicked out. If you don't do your job, you get kicked out. That ability is missing in South Africa. The ANC leadership is convinced they can't get thrown out.
Yeah.
And whatever the DA say, they're not whether it's 22% or 25% or 26%, it doesn't matter. You're not a viable opposition. So there's no threat, you get kicked out. And because there's no threat, there's no logic for you to become responsive to people, to citizens. That's the structural political gap in the South Africa. Now the question is, how do we create that together with a civil society?
Yeah.
Those two are the fundamental questions to turn South Africa around.
No, thanks so much, Prof. I really appreciate you
Bonga.
taking. Yeah.
Bonga, can I just raise one question to the Prof? Prof, it's just unfortunate I dwelled so much on racial issues and Click Saga.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I'm happy, go ahead.
Yes, I don't so much really did not have interest in outlining, but fine. I wanted to raise this issue on the higher education aspect now. Look, Prof, I think we've got a higher education crisis in South Africa. And, you know, I'm saying this because I'm looking at the fact that in 2018, over 600,000 people, right, sat down for their matric exams. And out of that 600,000 people, we would assume that an estimate of over at least 200,000 got bachelor passes, right? Then within that frame of 200,000 people, less than 80,000 people could go to institutions of higher learning, be it TVET colleges, be it universities. And I say this because it's a capacity issue, not necessarily the fact that we don't have students who want or who wish to pursue higher education qualifications, but there aren't enough spaces in institutions. And I say this because if you look at medical schools around the country, it's a fact that we have a healthcare crisis in South Africa. We need more manpower in the health fraternity, but we have about 7 medical schools across the country. Each one of them cannot take more than 250 people. That means across all of them, we can't accommodate more than 10,000 people within clinical practice degrees. Now the question is, Prof, what was so difficult, or what is the biggest challenge that we face at WITS, we face at other institutions of higher learning as well? Why can't we capacitate our own institutions, make sure that we have enough spaces for a lot of people who wish to pursue not only healthcare qualifications, but also STEM qualifications as well, your engineering? What is so difficult about that, Professor, considering that your university takes only one institution?
So here's the answer. So, by the way, your numbers are not all right, but actually your analysis is right. So we take in every year about 150,000. So we're still losing about another 100,000, because to go to TVET colleges, you don't need a bachelorette pass. So we're losing too many young people who are not coming into higher education. And that, I think you're absolutely right. So here's the simple problem. If you're looking, firstly, I think we have too few institutions and we need to build more. There is no doubt about it, that we need to build more institutions. And frankly, the fact that we built only 2 universities in the post-apartheid South Africa in 25 years is a hell of a crisis. Imagine in 95, we said, we're going to increase these universities were only built for 5 million people. We're now going to move black people there, which is 80% of the population. And then we only built 2 universities. It's a crazy thing to do. So that's the first problem. The second, if you look at any institution, any system in the world, you have to differentiate your institutions. So you don't have all of them doing the same thing. You have some that work in, if you go to the US, for all of its other problems, it's got 5,000 universities. About 2,500, 3,000 are crap, I'll tell you that. But they've got some fantastic institutions. And the ones that are this thing are differentiated. Some are land grant colleges that take in people for 2-year degrees. Some are liberal arts colleges that only do first degree. Some specialize in postgraduate. Like if you go to MIT, it has 65, 70% postgraduate students. You differentiate, you have a different mandate for each one, and you're able to move from one to the other. But Obama started a first degree in a college in Chicago. He got his law degree in Harvard. He could move right across the system. Ours, you get people stuck. If you start in Walter Sisulu, you can't move. You get stuck there unless you're lucky to get out, or if you're in vendor. So you need a differentiated mandate and a movement between them. That's the second. And third, I don't think up until now, too much of our vision about training was done solely on physical space. I think we need to use technology in a much more effective way, than we have. The problem is, how do we get connectivity? How do we get devices? And between you and me, this is a doable job if you had people with the capacity to do it. I mean, let's be honest. And I say this and people get angry. Go check cabinet. How many people in cabinet, ironically beside Blade now, because I think he does understand hygiene. How many people in cabinet actually understand the portfolios they've ever run? You think Nomvula, who was Minister of Water, ever understood how to run water? How to run sanitation system? How many people in the portfolio committee of higher education or health actually understand the job of actually doing it? Mm. And that's the challenge.
Yeah.
And until we start training people. But you're right, medical school. You know, we produced 1,200 doctors about 5 years ago. Now we produce about 1,600. For our size of our population, we have to produce 5,000 every year. We're producing 1,400 or 1,500. It's crazy. We have to rethink how we train. And we should be having a large number of people being trained for primary healthcare, mainly doctors, and then the big, heavy research stuff. We should have 4 or 5 focusing on that. And then you must be able to move. You can start. We're not approaching higher education. Let me say one final thing, because this is important. You know, I'm coming to an end as Vice Chancellor at WITS. I think the next 5 years is going to be really difficult. Because actually, I think there's going to be no cash. My fear is that within 2 years, 2.5 years, the state is going to have no money. So all of this money that's going into NSFAS, they're not going to have it anymore. The subsidy this year, they've chopped us between 5%. Next year is going to be 10%. Money going into universities is becoming lower. What that means is that within 2 years, I promise you, we're heading for another fees must fall. Because actually, the university vice chancellors are going to be caught. There's no money from the state. The only other way, it means they're going to have to start trading. The unions are saying, we want salary increases. The students are saying, we don't want to pay high fees, and the subsidy is declining. You're heading for a crisis.
Yeah.
I won't be here. But unless we figure this out now, we are in trouble. And that's why I think we need to talk about this.
All right. Prof, that's
I fully agree with you.
Gone above and beyond the time that we're going to go today. Appreciate you coming through, Prof. All the best again for the end of your tenure. I hope we manage to finish off the year well. And again, continue speaking to people, like especially young academics. I think it's powerful. I think it's good. A lot of them do need guidance some of the time, and I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to be able to speak like people like myself, Kana. It really goes a long way. So all the best. We'll be watching some of your stuff, especially in London, and hoping you continue to do good work.
All right, thanks guys. Nice meeting you guys.